Separation anxiety is where a dog goes out of its mind when you're not near it all the time, and that's a um, that's a very destructive behavior. They'll destroy the house or a door or whatever it is that they perceive is between them and you. They also usually injure themselves in the process because they're so distraught that they don't care what happens to their paws when they're working on that door or cage door or whatever. Um, Not every dog develops separation anxiety. There's certain breeds that I just don't think are even wired for that. I think there are a couple breeds that are completely hollow and don't care enough for people to even develop separation anxiety. I think there's a couple of breeds that are so loving and sweet that their brains are just like giant absorbent quaaludes and they just don't get worked up. But I think by and large, any dog can be made into a separation anxiety pet. And that's the purpose of this video, is to talk to you about ways to avoid um, creating a separation anxiety dog. I would say owning a separation anxiety dog is harder than a dog that has continence problems, harder than a dog with thunder phobia. I would say that probably separation anxiety dogs are the hardest problem to cope with because it can be so destructive. And I think a lot of people they consider the effect of separation anxiety on themselves, such as when I come home, my living room is destroyed, or all the stuffing is taken out of my sofa, or the doors are wrecked, or whatever. I don't think that they look at it from the dog's standpoint, and that is that the dog is in terror when you're not around. I think to a certain extent, if you truly can't bring it under control, you have to consider what a life of terror looks like for the dog and see it from both standpoints. Hard on the owner, very hard on the dog as far as quality of life is concerned. Management of separation anxiety in dogs comes in the form of often, for better or worse, medications. Even the SSRIs and the benzodiazepine tranquilizers and that sort of thing can all benefit. The one doctor told me that the purpose of medications was to establish communication, to where the dog would be absorbent to some message of, training out of that behavior. And the purpose of training was to get the dog off of the drugs. I like that. So the medication creates communication where there is none, and then the training or communication eliminates the need for the medication. Besides medications, there is some people will actually quit their jobs and they will stay at home with the pet and they will gradually acclimate it to you being not around. So you would basically pick up your keys, jingle the keys as if you were leaving. You'd go out the front door, walk around to the side of the house, and really before the dog even has a chance to get wound up, you would show up, I'm home, and the dog would go, all right, that wasn't so bad. And you would do that through a series of days, and you would probably a sabbatical from work. You wouldn't probably actually have to quit your job. You could just take a month or two off of work. I mean, so what? Um, and acclimate the dog gradually with longer and longer trips away from the house um, until finally it was sort of used to you not being around. Um, so acclimation is a way. Drugs are a way of managing separation anxiety. But if we avoided separation anxiety in the first place, that would be that would be the bomb diggity. And so there's some things that you can do when they're young to keep separation anxiety from happening. And then I have a recommendation for if you ended up inheriting a dog or fostering a dog or whatever that had separation anxiety. I have some ideas on that. My mother was a perfect example of how a person could control or prevent separation anxiety in a dog. Her background, basically, in a brief synopsis, is she was raised Pennsylvania Dutch, They're like Mennonite, Amish, no nonsense people, and she was one of 7 kids. And as such, with 7 kids and a mom with multiple sclerosis and a dad who was being a doctor all the time, they almost raised each other. And when you have 7 kids, you can't accommodate every single one of their idiosyncrasies and preferences and all of that. There was a great deal of quote get over it end quote in their lives. Um, Goodness, back in those days, most of what you wrestled with, as far as your personal baggage, was wrestled alone, and there was just with 7 kids moving in one direction, the mom and dad just had to say get over it, and so they did. We didn't end up a lot of kids ended up with a lot of repression and carrying their baggage around. I get it, but there was uh, there was a lot less coddling. Well, it turns out that has some bearing on dogs, because I think that's where people mess up these days, is they're raising dogs that are essentially millennials. Um, they're not letting the dog experience any adversity. It's easy to do these days. I mean, you can have your dog with you a lot of places. Um, you can, for a while, um, it's not hard to get your dog to be one of those dogs that you can put a sweater on and take with you on an airplane just by saying that, there's a problem. So, and then as puppies, we carry them around, we put them in bags and perambulators and all of that. And so we have them with us, and people are putting them in their beds as puppies, putting the crate next to the bed at night when they first bring them home, and a ton of very sensitive, very loving things. I get that. I would like to do that with my own dog, and I was tempted all the time to take Ajax and keep him up under me all the time. But that's how you make a separation anxiety dog, because during their formative period, the first 16 weeks of their life, if they're not exposed to much of anything but you and they're always with you, well, then when they're not with you, they're going out of their mind. So, to a certain extent, you have to treat a puppy to small doses of adversity, small doses of not getting exactly what they want when they want it, not always getting their way. It's kind of the thing. So what that means is sometimes when you put them in the crate, um, let them cry if they want out, and it's not time to get out. Get over it. Um, if they're crying in their crate out in the garage or downstairs, don't go get them, and don't put the crate next to your bed. Let them get over it. Um, if something scares them a little, if you run and scoop them up and coddle them, you're validating that. I mean, if they were chased by a Rottweiler or something, I get that. But if a loud noise startles them or whatever, and you race to them and hold them, um, they're looking to you for your response to something. And if you act like nothing happened, they have a tendency to internalize that, and it makes them less nervous. But if a loud noise or a piece of furniture falls over and it startles them, and you race to them and pick them up and coo them, you're going to contribute to a separation anxiety dog, a very insecure dog that depends on you basically to tell it how to think. Sometimes I'll hear a dog being, let's say, unruly out in the waiting room. It throws its head back and just starts barking into the air. And it just keeps doing that. And I don't understand why it keeps doing that, except that it wants to, let everyone know that it's there, or that it wants to go home, or whatever that it seems to be saying. Every dog has a different message. Sometimes it's just, I'm here, let's go play with the other dogs in the waiting room. I don't know. And the owner sits almost as if helpless to stop it from doing that. And then the dog will act up in the exam room, and sometimes they just go after me, or they go after a handler, or they go after the owner. And then when they leave, they're pulling on the leash, and the owner can't even organize themselves to get their keys to go out of the clinic because the dog is acting so badly. And the comment that's made is usually one that with a certain amount of sympathy for that owner, but is that dog's never heard the word no in its life. That the owner has kind of taken a back seat to the needs of the dog, that they regard it as a child, which is not inappropriate, okay? Because to a certain extent, they function that way for us. And I think that's a beautiful part of the relationship we have with them. But it doesn't extend all the way across the board to where we need to accommodate them at every need the way we perhaps might with a child. Although I must say, sometimes I think that people are sterner or um, more appropriately um, disciplined with their children than they might be with a dog. Um, Dogs should face a certain degree of adversity. Sometimes I think the best owners are 6 year olds. And I'll tell you why I think that is because 6 year olds will forget to feed their dog. Sometimes they'll miss a meal. And sometimes I think that's good for a dog because it develops a sense of adversity that every meal isn't, planned and coaxed. And definitely with 6 year olds, there's no effort to, quote, get them to eat, which is how dogs get fat. A 6 year old has a tendency to throw food down and wander off. And that's the best way to feed a dog. If it's not hungry, it doesn't need to eat. If you skip a meal or you miss a meal, that's probably better for the dog unless you miss like 5 in a row. Um, 6 year olds won't let a dog play bite its hands. Typically, a 4 or 5 year old doesn't know what to do to stop a dog from chewing on its hands as a puppy. A 6 year old, on the other hand, will just bonk that dog on the nose, which is pragmatic. There are other, a little bit more elegant ways to stop a dog from play biting your hands, but I think to a certain extent, the 6 year olds have it figured out. Dog play bites their hands, the 6 year old bonks him on the nose. Dog figures out that's no fun, stops play biting the kid's hands. And then it gets messed up by the time they're 8 because they being trained to use their words and they try to talk a dog out of play biting their hands. Uh, no, I'm not advocating hitting dogs. I don't do that. If a 6 year old does that to stop his hands from getting scratched up by needle teeth from a puppy, I guess more power to him. What is a 6 year old armed with as far as skills to train a dog? Um, anyway, so to avoid separation anxiety, it's basically allow the dog to experience a certain degree of adversity. Don't accommodate it at its every need. Don't have it with you constantly. There are times when it's a good idea to put that dog in a crate. Maybe for a while or a couple nights a week or whatever, it would sleep in a crate away from you. When you're out of the house, put it in a crate. Tell it no from time to time. In my career, I've met one dog. If there were a couple, that's possible, but I'm only remembering one that was genuinely, literally wired neurotic. And there was nothing that anyone could do, even the sweetest, gentlest, kindest, most sensitive owner could not make Dee Dee into a calm pet. I look back on that now and I realize that about halfway through that process, we should have let that dog go because it literally existed in perpetual terror. I don't know what happened to that dog. I know that it came off the street neurotic and feral and remained neurotic and feral. And the third owner that stepped in was fairly accomplished at pet ownership and had dealt with some difficult pets before, and took Dee Dee in and spent years with that dog. And then when it finally came time, and she came in for her departure as an elderly dog, she was still absolutely neurotic and had always been. And so I don't know about that. I mean, I think some dogs are wired that way, but I don't think most of them are wired that way. So if somebody gave me a separation anxiety dog, let's say that there was a dog that was extraordinary, and the owner was giving it up or going to have it put down because it was a very destructive separation anxiety pet, um, I would consider that fairly simple, and it has to do with a kind of a get over it attitude. And that would be, I would go on Craigslist or eBay or any of a variety of secondhand places, and I would get a veterinary suitable cage. They're made by Suburban or Shoreline, and I guess bars of the cage doors are thick, thicker than a pencil. The interiors of the cage have no sharp edges. They have usually have grates, and a dog can pretty much go out of its mind if it wants, and it won't damage itself by and large. And I would put the pet in that, and that would be where it would be when I could not supervise it, or didn't have it out for a walk, or didn't have it out to sit with me in the living room, or wasn't interacting with it. Then it would go back into these veterinary suitable kind of almost padded room sort of cages, and it would adapt to that. They are animals. They will adapt. I realize that now I will get death threats from PETA for suggesting that an animal deal with the adversity of being in a compartment instead of destroying your door, but I'll live with that. Um, because they will adapt. I recall a story of two dogs that had been willed to me by their owner. She used to come in and say, "When I die, you're going to take my dogs for me, right?" And I was like, "Oh, sure, Ruth, no problem." And she finally died, and I got a call, and Officer Franklin down at the animal control said, "We got these two dogs here. You need to come get them." And I was like, "What?" And it turned out that when Ruth died, she actually had put them in the will. Um, she put them in the will along with 30,000 or 30,000 bucks. The executor of the will gave me the dogs, but kept the money. Um, that was extraordinary, and that was fine. I kept them till they were very old. They lived at my office. Many people know them, Misty and Pepper. I tell you that story in that when they first came, I knew that Ruth had been feeding them. They had a specific kind of china that they ate off of. It was blue willow china, and Misty would only eat her egg if you've fried it sunny side up. And I don't remember what Peppy's idiosyncrasies were, but she would only eat under specific circumstances either. And I think you could only be laying on the floor; you couldn't kneel to get them to eat. And so when they came in, I was working with a gal named Beth, and I remember this. I said, "Beth, go put them in the third run, please. Put KD, which is a kidney sparing dog diet for good old dogs, and it's delicious, made with milk and egg proteins and all that." And I said, "Put them in the third run and give them KD until they eat it, and let me know if they don't eat it, and I'll call the crematory." I didn't say exactly that, but that was the thing. Um, she had spoiled them beyond all recognition, and I wasn't going to do that. And pets are very adaptable, and so I we put them in run three, and we fed them and walked them and fed them and walked them, almost like a boarding situation. And we let them deal with it, get over it. They ate KD eventually. They didn't have to have blue willow china, and they didn't have to have the eggs sunny side up. In fact, they didn't have to have eggs at all, and they lived a very long time not eating that cholesterol and all the bacon. And actually, Misty had kind of a cantankerous personality, and she did live the longest of all of them. She lived to be at least 17 years old. I'd have to check with Heather, but that dog lived a very long time. And um, so there was kind of basically almost adversity therapy. It's like, fine, don't eat, starve to death, and they didn't. It would be the same thing with separation anxiety. If I got a separation anxiety dog and I didn't want to buy a cage and manage the whole situation, I would board it. Perhaps even with somebody that does play care to socialize the dog in a more outbound fashion. But if that wasn't available, then I would just board it, and then it would not be with an owner constantly sleeping on the bed, and it would deal with that adversity, and it would, in all probability, it would become adapted to a more normal existence with different social horizons, and it would be okay being by itself. And then when I brought it home, or when I stopped um, crating it all the time, I would only be crating it when I left, and then eventually I would not need to crate it at all because it had developed a certain sense of adversity and the ability to be away from me. I really don't think people should put separation anxiety dogs down. I think it is way better to force the dog to adapt than it is to just say, I don't want you to have to go through this, I'm putting you down. That's my that's my opinion. So to finish this discussion, because it's 20 minutes long and I'm sorry it ran on for so long, in a nutshell, I would say that to avoid the incidence of separation anxiety in dogs, it starts as a puppy, and that is to allow the dogs to experience a degree of adversity. Let them just get over it when you're away. Put them in a crate, keep them in a crate away from your bedroom. Don't have them up under you all the time. Do not hesitate to tell them no. Um, some discipline and a certain amount of expectation that they stand on their own 2 feet and don't grovel to the dog. It's a dog. It may be your best friend, and that much I support, but it needs messages that are far clearer and more concrete than humans eventually do. And all they need to know is something's okay or not okay, and they file that away and respond appropriately to it. And if you accept that and expect it early on, then their responses have a tendency to be more appropriate later. So, as my mother used to say, let the dog know that they have to get over it. And so when it comes to you being away, they will, period.